Welcome, everyone, for another week's lecture of the Rising Tide Foundation Symposium series on Statecraft, where we've been working very hard over the course of about 4 months to try to reinfuse some dignity and meaning into that very abused word statecraft, which has been dragged through the mud by a bunch of sophists and liars for far too long. So beginning, I think, in March, we began this process 5 movements ago, where we began looking at the ancient times, periods of ancient Athens, ancient China. And we had our presentation, our symposium opened up with a class on Confucius and Plato, brothers at the two edges of the world island, by Dr. Quan Le, followed up by a series of presentations that took us through the ages, dealing with different particular singularities of human history, where great human beings who overcame their fears, their anxieties, their ignorance to walk onto the stage of history when they were the most needed and not be tragic, made a leap into uplifting both science and the arts, and specifically political economy, in a variety of ways which were all touching on the same thing, which dealt with the nature of human beings as being a creature which was more than just the thing that imperialists wish us to believe we are, which is, you know, beasts fighting over scraps in a world of diminishing returns, but rather a species that has something divine, capable of overcoming the limits to growth and leap into discovery concepts as we leap into mentally the laws of the universe and translate them into new discoveries. So we've had a fun journey up until this moment. This current movement began with a presentation by David Wang. For those who missed it, it's going to be in the description box of this video, dealing with the forgotten Confucian Chinese roots of the American Revolution, with a great focus on Benjamin Franklin as one exemplar of a Renaissance thinker of a more recent period, which again has mostly been forgotten and written out of history. We've had presentations by Cynthia on the Bandung Conference and the lost potentials of the anti-imperial movement of the 1950s and 60s that were subverted in a variety of ways. But yet the idea is the potential still exists and is being reactivated today in ways that many people here in the West are just not aware, basically because we have the media, which doesn't talk about these things. And because of that, we're not aware of the revival of this thing that was put into motion by Plato, that was revived, that was carried forward throughout the period of St. Augustine and Charlemagne that we'd looked at earlier, that was again brought back to life after a long period of dark age with the Renaissance. And with Sun Yat-sen, which was the last presentation we had by Dr. Quan Le, who reviewed how Sun Yat-sen was able to organize the overthrow of a dynastic system and the installation of a republican form of government, though it was never complete. Just like the American Revolution was not complete, so neither was the Chinese Revolution of 1911. But despite that, there was a continued movement towards progress that we went through in our last presentation, from Sun Yat-sen onward to the Belt and Road today, which currently is exemplifying in many ways some of the best, most important dynamics of history in opposition to this unipolar system of empire, which is sort of latched on like a parasite. So I'm very happy today that we're able to close up this 5th movement of our symposium with a presentation tackling another aspect of history, as well as present and future geopolitical dynamics, with another facet, this time focusing, as Jeff Steinberg has made the point, the Russian-American paradox. With some important history, a lot of Americans have been, and Canadians and Europeans have been induced by a lot of propaganda to be afraid not only of China as the big bad boogeyman of the world, but also of Russia. This susceptibility to falling for a lot of this is only made possible by people's profound ignorance to the principled elementary dynamics of history, which is why I'm just so happy that Jeff is going to go through a lot of this with us. I'm going to refrain from going through Jeff's entire bio, but it's incredibly impressive and people can read it on our symposium page. Jeff, I know this is a condensed form of a larger class, and I'm really happy that you're doing this, so I'm going to leave the stage to you.
Thanks. Can everybody hear me all right?
Sure, fine.
Okay, great. Before escaping from the Beltway, a number of years back, I attended an event. I don't remember if it was at Brookings or at Carnegie, but it was at one of those DC think tanks. And the topic revolved around the situation in Ukraine, the conflict between NATO and Russia. And I had the audacity to ask the panel a question, having spoken with a number of people who were at the table at the very end of the Cold War, not even yet at the point of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but when the agreement was reached between the United States, the Soviet Union, Germany, about the reunification of Germany. And I've not only read, but heard presentations by Ambassador Jack Matlock, and also had the opportunity to get to know former head of the German Bundeswehr, who also happened to be at the table for those negotiations. And all of them were absolutely clear in the fact that it was understood that the Soviets would not object to German reunification and Germany remaining in NATO, with the clear understanding that there would be no further eastward expansion of NATO. And this was widely understood for a variety of reasons. It was left at a handshake understanding, partly because of the difficulties of getting treaty agreements through the United States Senate, but also because, as all the participants described it, there was a certain feeling of optimism about the future relationship, and that it was understood that a handshake agreement was a fairly binding agreement. And of course, less than a decade later, that deal was busted. And particularly, we had the color revolutions in Ukraine. And so I asked the speakers about looking at these events from the Russian perspective, and whether or not the violation of that critical agreement was really the start of a accelerating degeneration of relations. A British woman at one of the think tanks on the panel gave a very telling response. She dismissed my question and refused to answer it on the grounds that I was presenting the Russian narrative. And after all, politics is about the battle of who controls the narrative, never mind whether there's any truth behind it or not. So at the very outset of this presentation, I want to make it clear that I will be presenting a narrative that is contrary in almost every respect to the official narrative that you hear around Washington and European capitals about the nature of the relationship between the United States and Europe. And so I think, as Matt indicated, history is a critical factor in understanding the relationship. And to me, the great paradox in the Russian-American relationship is that the US and Russia have had a unique, long history of friendship and collaboration on an important strategic scale. And that entire history tends to be ignored with the intensity of the current anti-Russian rhetoric. And so I want to sort of go through a sort of a sweep of history running from the period of the American Revolution through to fairly recent events. It's going to be fairly quick. Obviously, I want to leave a good deal of time for Q&A and discussion, but I think it'll give you, even in a brushstroke, an idea of just how much is ignored in the ideological anti-Russia attitudes that are so prominent in the United States and in Europe, in some respects, even more so today. So basically, Russia played an indispensable role in the success of the American Revolution. In February of 1780, Catherine the Great played a pivotal role in establishing the League of Armed Neutrality with a number of other European countries, in effect saying to the British that they cannot blockade the flow of supplies to the American revolutionaries without effectively provoking a war in Europe. So the American Revolution, in many respects, was an international event of profound importance, and Russia played a very critical role. Initially, the British Crown sought to reach an agreement with Catherine in which they would hire Russian mercenaries, much as they later hired Hessian mercenaries, to be part of the military force to crush the American Revolution. And there were lucrative offers for the Russians to do exactly that. And yet, instead, for a variety of reasons, probably some of which were moral and some of which were geopolitical, the decision was made to side with the Americans. And it played a very, very crucial role in the early phases, even before the French were fully involved as our actual allies. And so there was already a framework for a certain development of an American-Russian cooperation. Now, that was not premised on the idea that the principles of government were identical, but it was premised on the idea that there were certain common features involving Russia and the United States. Vast territory, relatively small population compared to the size. And so there were a lot of things that were points of common interest. In 1787, one of the naval heroes of the American Revolution, John Paul Jones, received a commission in the Russian Navy as an admiral, and brought with him some of the blueprints for some of the American battleship designs. And so again, you had this phenomenon of a certain openness between the brand new United States of America and Russia. And we're going to see that those ties continued and deepened. Again, because of the many areas of comparison, the economic challenges that were presented in both Russia and in the new United States, some of the most critical economic writings from the early American Republic, particularly Alexander Hamilton's report on the manufacturing, was translated and widely disseminated inside Russia. And the translator, V. Malinovsky, in his introduction to the Russian language version of the report to the Congress on the manufactures, said the similarity of American United Provinces and Russia appears both in the expanse of the land, climate, and natural conditions, size of population disproportionate to space, and in the general youthfulness of various generally useful institutions. And so basically, these ideas that were a cornerstone of the early success of the American Republic were absolutely suitable and appropriate for application in Russia. So from the very early period on, and we're going to see a continuation of this view, there was an understanding that there were stark differences between the policies and attitudes among some of the institutions in the United States from those in Europe and generally of the European colonial powers. And many developments along the way reinforced and developed lines of communication. In 1809, President James Monroe appointed John Quincy Adams as the first American ambassador to Russia, and he spent about 6 years there, and again, integrated into the Russian Academy of Sciences, made other writings of the American Revolution widely known and distributed inside Russia. It had a dramatic impact as well on John Quincy Adams. And for example, because Russia was a contested territory between American influences and cooperation and that of the British, John Quincy Adams had the occasion while in St. Petersburg to meet Jeremy Bentham and a number of other characters, Joseph de Maistre, who was a pivotal figure in the whole French Revolution. And he wrote in his personal memoirs that these were two of the most despicable and bizarre people he'd ever met in his life. So, you know, he was there representing an American outlook and an American interest inside the Russian court as the American ambassador. So these kinds of channels of communication and interest continued. In 1832, Russia was the first country to be granted most favored nation trade status by the United States. And shortly after that, as the United States was beginning to develop the early expansion of railroads, American Corps of Engineer and related railroad engineers went to Russia and played a direct role in helping to design and build the first major rail link between Moscow and St. Petersburg. One of them was a military engineer named Whistler, whose brother made his mother famous. So these relationships continued to build and develop as the United States and Russia moved through the early half of the 19th century. On March 28th of 1861, President Abraham Lincoln named Cassius Marcellus Clay as the US minister to Russia. Clay was a leading advocate of American system economic policies, which Lincoln was a big advocate of through his own training by Henry Clay during the brief period of time that they were in Congress together. And in fact, Lincoln gave the eulogy at one of the commemorations upon Clay's death. This is a different Clay family, but Cassius Marcellus Clay arrived in St. Petersburg at the time that Czar Alexander II was emancipating the serfs as a reflection of some improvements in modernization of the Russian economy. Clay returned to the United States briefly to serve in the Union Army during the Civil War and was one of the leading advisors to Lincoln, really pressing for Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. So within a short period of time, first Russia freed the serfs, and then Lincoln announced the freeing of the slaves. Clay returned, and one of the things that he did was to negotiate the US purchase of Alaska. This had been something that the Russians had been offering earlier during the 1840s, but at that time, the Russians were really promoting the idea that the Americans who had developed the northwest region of the United States should move further north and establish the west coast, the British Columbia province of Canada and north of there as part of the United States, so that with the sale of Alaska to the US, there would be a contiguous area of the western United States that would stretch right up to the Bering Straits. And we'll see that this has been a theme that continued well into the 19th century and beyond. The Civil War was another occasion where the unique relationship between the United States and Russia played a critical role. In September of 1863, 6 Russian Navy ships arrived in New York and 6 arrived in San Francisco. The commander of those ships carried a secret communique that if at any point any European powers, and that time it could have very well been the British and or the French, if any European powers entered the war on the side of the Confederacy, then the control over those 12 Russian Navy ships would be handed over to President Lincoln. If you were to go to the New York Public Library and look up some of the New York newspapers from that period of time, you would basically see some of the earliest photographs and news cartoons showing crowds of people at the docks greeting these Russian ships, and the Russian Navy officers and sailors coming off the ships were, you know, basically greeted as heroes and great allies. So again, this continuity of a spiritual kinship between the United States and Russia, again, played an important role in the outcome of the Civil War. It's not to say that this was a decisive or turning point factor, but among other things, it again illustrated that there were European powers that were absolutely committed to the breakup of the United States. And there were others, including Russia in particular, who were very much committed to helping to defend the Union. Now, in the aftermath of the Civil War, one of the, I think, really great aspects of the Lincoln presidency was that even in the face of civil war and the existential threat of the survival of the Union, Lincoln pressed ahead with legislation in 1861, 1862 to establish the framework for building the Transcontinental Railroad. Of course, it was not until after the Civil War that the intensive phases of construction really began. It became one of the largest jobs programs in history, and among other things, because much of the workforce was soldiers from both the Union and the Confederacy who had fought in the Civil War. It tended to be something that bound the country somewhat back together again after that horrible experience. And when the link was completed in 1869, and they were simultaneously laying telegraph lines as they were moving eastward from the West Coast and westward from about Omaha, Nebraska, when the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, it really did provide a greater degree of integration of the entire continental republic. But subsequently, Czar Alexander III authorized the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway, and it was very much modeled on the Transcontinental Railroad in the United States. And not surprisingly, this vast undertaking, much greater than the distance from Omaha out to the West Coast, 5,772 miles from Moscow to Vladivostok, the Americans played a pivotal role in the entire effort, which was finally fully completed in 1916, so on the verge of the Bolshevik Revolution. American companies provided a lot of the basic material for the construction. American engineers were prominent among those who were working with their Russian partners in developing the Trans-Siberian. The Baldwin Locomotive Company of Philadelphia did special designs for the locomotives and then manufactured them and shipped them over to Russia to deal with the terrain and other challenges. So again, it was not just simply a kind of, top down, but it was a real cooperative sense among elements within the United States and Russia of working together and seeing certain common geographic challenges that they could work together on mastering. In 1906, Tsar Nicholas II authorized plans to develop construction of a bridge across the Bering Straits that would link the Russian Far East with the Western Hemisphere through Alaska. And the original design for the bridge was completed in 1890, and the engineer who did that would later design the Golden Gate Bridge outside of San Francisco. Now, this is something that has been a project that has at least been a thought object for a very, very long time. In 2007 or so, maybe 2010, I forget the exact year, there was a major conference in Moscow, and there's been a whole group of people, both in Russia and in the United States, who've been promoting this idea of a bridge and tunnels across the Bering Straits to establish those commercial links. The more recent designs involve basically building two tunnels that would connect together on one of the islands in the middle of the Bering Straits that would be essentially the equivalent of the channel that runs across the English Channel. So these ideas have carried forward. The former governor of Alaska has been one of the leading advocates, along with many people in Russia, for the idea of finally completing this concept. Now it would be much more advanced. It would be a tunnel, it would be rail links, perhaps a bridge, fiber optic cables, a whole array of things. So these ideas and a reflection of a certain spirit of cooperation between Russia and the United States has a long and enduring, albeit buried, tradition. Now, I found it fascinating that even in the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution, this concept of a similar outlook between Russia and the United States was still critical. Lenin's new economic policy, his whole idea of electrification of the entire Soviet Union, was very much based on looking at the engineering and scientific accomplishments of the United States. And, you know, whatever criticisms you may have of Henry Ford and Frederick Taylor, they were kind of iconic figures symbolizing America's development into a major modern industrial power. And Lenin explicitly talked about the idea that the new economic policy should be modeled on the accomplishments of the United States, and that the US should be explicitly asked to help participate in these developments. The models that they talked about were the Ford River Rouge plant to be built along the Volga River, the early phases of the Muscle Shoals hydroelectric projects were models for how the Russians wanted to proceed. And American companies became directly involved in these projects. In May of 1929, Henry Ford signed a contract and agreed to send hundreds of Ford workers to the Soviet Union to oversee the construction and then setting up of production for automobile, tractor, and truck plants. And so these ties continued. Obviously, at a later period, during Lend-Lease, the US supplied an enormous amount of military equipment and related assistance to the Soviet Union. $11 billion was pumped in Ford-produced locomotives for the Russian railroads. Studebaker produced trucks and other equipment for the Red Army. And many, many combat aircraft for the Soviet Air Force were produced under the Arsenal of Democracy program under President Roosevelt. And so this process, obviously, again, under wartime conditions, was absolutely vital. In his 2004 memoirs, Khrushchev reflected on his personal conversations with Stalin about the impact of Lend-Lease. And you can see the quote there. Stalin basically said, without the Lend-Lease assistance from the United States, the Soviet Union could not have won the war. If they had had to fight Nazi Germany one-on-one, they could not have stood up against German pressure. And so this was something that was deeply felt and understood. And so this, I want to emphasize, long continuity, long history, obviously only represents one side of a picture that had many negatives to it. Those negatives are, I think, quite familiar to all of you on this call, and so I'm not going to waste a lot of time on that. I mean, you had the Palmer raids. You had what would emerge at the end of the war as first Trumanism and then McCarthyism. And of course, on March 5th, 1946, Winston Churchill delivered his famous Iron Curtain speech from Fulton, Missouri. And, you know, clearly Churchill had an influence on Truman's thinking, but when he was in the Senate in 1940, Truman argued very strenuously that the best US policy was to simply let Germany and the Soviet Union batter each other into destruction. And so Truman's policies were distinctly different from the outlook of President Roosevelt. If you want to really get an appreciation of this, it's worth finding a copy of Elliott Roosevelt's book, As He Saw It, which he wrote in 1946 because he was so upset at how radically US policy had shifted from his father's perspective to that of the Truman administration and the overarching influence of Churchill and the Cold War faction. And so he described in great detail, because he was his father's adjutant during all of Roosevelt's overseas travels for the major summits throughout the war. So I think these are all things to, just bear in mind. So in rapid succession, you had the Washington Treaty signed establishing NATO. April 7th, 1950, Truman signed NSC 68, which effectively militarized the Cold War. But all of that having been said, there was still an impulse among some American leaders to have a different attitude towards the Soviet Union. When Eisenhower came in as president, one of the earliest things that he did in the summer of 1953 was to conduct something called Project Solarium. And he was under enormous pressure. You had the Dulles brothers, you had Curtis LeMay, you had an entire apparatus that was committed to the idea of an eventual war with the Soviet Union. The development of the hydrogen bomb, all of those things were the backdrop. But Eisenhower, in his 1952 campaign for president, had criticized the militarization of the Cold War. And early in the summer, he convened a group of State Department and Pentagon officials at the Solarium room at the White House. And he broke them down into 3 groups to conduct a long-term study perspective on how the US should address the challenge from the Soviet Union. One group that was headed up by George Kennan was to basically develop a long-term strategy of war avoidance while developing a plan for ultimately meeting the Soviet challenge. Another group were to take a more militaristic position and take the Soviet Union directly on every time they moved outside the immediate geographic bounds of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. The third group, which Curtis LeMay was a part of, were to actually take up the question of a preemptive war with the Soviets, rollback operations, and all the rest. When the group met at Fort McNair after a couple of months of study, Eisenhower opted for the view that, that a long-term strategy of containment and war avoidance was the best option given all of the pressure points within the foreign policy establishment to want to look for the opportunity to go to war. Eisenhower also looked for opportunities to begin some process of military disarmament and a framework for bilateral relations, even under the conditions of the Cold War. In July of 1955, Eisenhower proposed an open skies agreement with the Soviet Union, in which both countries would provide maps of all military installations and permit a certain number of unarmed overflights to verify compliance. And at that time, Khrushchev rejected the proposal because he did not want to reveal certain Soviet military deficiencies. Remember, in the 1960s elections, there was a big debate over the missile gap, and which proved to be vastly exaggerated. But, you know, Eisenhower, from his own wartime experience with Marshal Zhukov, who was in the 1950s the Russian Minister of Defense, he had a more balanced and nuanced approach. It was certainly not anything along the lines of the century of intensive political and economic cooperation and good feelings between the US and Russia, but it was at least an attempt to mitigate against some of the worst pressures from the Cold War. Now, some of you have perhaps had a chance to review these documents, but I found them fascinating. The day that John Kennedy was elected president in November of 1960, Khrushchev sent a fairly standard telegram of congratulations. And Kennedy responded by suggesting that he and Khrushchev should establish a personal line of direct communication, an exchange of letters and telegrams outside the formal framework of state-to-state relations. And the basic idea was that between Kennedy and Khrushchev, they held the fate, the survival of mankind in their hands, because by now, both the United States and the Soviet Union had developed very formidable arsenals of nuclear weapons and delivery systems. And the correspondence back and forth, a total of over 120 private exchanges, I think was absolutely critical in the ultimate resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis, where there were pressures from both the US and the Soviet military to respond in a really Brinksman-like way. But there was a certain mutual understanding between the two men that basically they understood the awesome responsibilities on their shoulders and their shoulders alone. And so there was a sense that there had to be some basis for avoiding what could have been a war of extinction. Many other factors, of course, were involved in that, but I, for one, think if you read the correspondence, which is available on the State Department website, that you'll see a certain personal factor that, again, developed here. The agreement to have that exchange led to some of the very earliest efforts at crafting some sort of limitations on the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Again, it's very much worth reading Kennedy's speech delivered June 10th, 1963 at the commencement exercises at American University, called A Strategy for Peace, calling for a number of these beginning phase of nuclear disarmament negotiations. And in fact, it led in August to the signing of the first partial test ban treaty. But quite clearly, if you read that speech, you'll see that Kennedy had in mind that it was high time to bring an end to the Cold War. We won't know ever what exactly he fully had in mind in terms of a recasting and redefining of the US-Soviet relationship. But nevertheless, we have that speech as at least a indicator. So again, over a very long sweep of time, from the founding days of the American Republic, there was this current, there was this tendency towards seeing a different kind of US-Russia, US-Soviet relationship. And I gave a bit of short shrift to it for time reasons, but there were a series of excellent articles in American Heritage magazine that went through the details of how much of a role American industry and American labor played in the development of the Soviet economy during and following the NEP program. Much of it was carried out during the Stalin period, but again, there were foundations that had been laid over the course of a century and an understanding among some of the Russian leadership that the United States was different. It was not just simply a Western colonial imperial power, that there were other aspects and that there was perhaps a basis for cooperation, collaboration. 1972, the US and the Soviet Union signed the SALT I Treaty, the ABM Treaty, and the Biological Weapons Convention. In 1975, the Soviets initiated the creation of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, involving 30 plus countries. It involved the signing of the Helsinki Accords. So there was a certain sense of opportunities that were being developed during even the Nixon period towards détente between the US and the Soviet Union. Science was also always an area where there was the potential for cooperation. July 1975, the first joint US-Soviet space mission, the Apollo-Soyuz test flight. And again, Brezhnev's comments that the vantage point of American spacemen and Russian cosmonauts from outer space really opened up a new potential era in the history of mankind, and that the prospect for living in peace was there, and that the dangers of nuclear war were also very clear given the smallness of Earth as seen from outer space. Now, much controversy surrounds President Reagan's March 23rd, 1983 speech announcing the Strategic Defense Initiative. But underlying that proposal was an idea of joint US-Soviet development of defensive systems that could replace the doctrine of mutually assured destruction with a doctrine of mutually assured survival. And for a complex set of reasons involving American internal politics, Russian economic concerns, Premier Andropov rejected the Reagan proposal, but it was still, as opposed to the way many people framed it, the idea that Reagan had, and he was very much influenced by some of the leading scientists around Lawrence Livermore and other laboratories when he was governor of California, that there had to be a better alternative than this concept of mutually assured destruction, that the survival of mankind hinged on this idea that nobody would want to take the steps that would obliterate mankind. He had a better concept. And even at a later point, when Yeltsin was the president of Russia, in his first summit meeting with President Clinton, the idea of reviving and revisiting that concept of cooperation was put on the table. Now, obviously, 1989 to 1991, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, during that period, put the question, as I mentioned earlier, of German reunification on the table. And again, the negotiations that took place beginning in 1990, leading to the formal agreement, August 31st, 1990, of German reunification within NATO, is something that, again, was indicative of another potential moment where the prospect of cooperation was possible. It was clearly understood by all of the people in the room that in return for Germany being reunited without Germany leaving NATO, that there would be a permanent buffer zone between the eastern border of NATO and the western border of the Soviet Union, shortly thereafter Russia, Belarus, and that Ukraine was in the middle of it. I had an opportunity before leaving Washington to meet with the German general who was part of the NATO military commission at the time, who was involved in those negotiations, Germany, the Soviet Union, the United States, and he had the identical formulation to Ambassador Jack Matlock, that it was clearly understood that there was to be a neutral buffer area centered around Ukraine. And remember, Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons, which was part of the Western Soviet nuclear arsenal. And it was clearly understood that this would be an area that would be economically free to link up with Russia, with the European Union, but would remain a neutral zone. And that was the cornerstone of the understandings that were reached as we moved into this new phase of the post-Soviet, post-Cold War period. Now, this is the exact wording of Ambassador Jack Matlock. We gave categorical assurance to Gorbachev, back when the Soviet Union existed, that a united Germany in NATO and NATO would not move eastward. Point blank declarative sentence, it was an understanding that before the end of the decade was broken. And that, to my view, was a critical turning point. And you can't adequately overestimate the significance of that action and the implications it had for the Russian leadership and how they viewed the strategic situation from that point moving forward. Now, a friend of mine was a longtime career American diplomat. His name is Ambassador Chas Freeman. He was the translator for Kissinger and Nixon during the early secret negotiations with Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai over normalization of US relations with China. He was later the ambassador to Saudi Arabia. And during the Clinton administration, he had a position inside the Pentagon. And he was one of the principal authors of a concept called the Partnership for Peace. The idea was that in lieu of any NATO expansion eastward, that there would be a kind of cooperative arrangement and that there would be a framework for security dialogue and cooperation to deal with common threats. And so the Partnership for Peace was established in 1993, and Russia was one of the very first countries to join it. So this structure was established, again, with a clear understanding that there would be no NATO expansion eastward. And I think that framework had the potential to have evolved were it not for the decision a few years later to actually move towards NATO expansion, which began in 1999 with Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, other countries being added after that. And so the cumulative effect of all of that has been that we now find ourselves in a very different, unfortunate, and unnecessary kind of confrontation. And I think that the opportunities that are there with a proper understanding of this longer wave of Russian-American history.
Exactly.
Something that needs to be re-invoked, taught again, And this is, to my mind, the best way to get at the paradox of what I view as an insane policy towards Russia that has evolved largely on the basis of a willful ignorance of this much longer and much more important and positive history. Just to close up here, this is the NATO presence. And if you think about the German border and look at how it's extended directly to the borders of Russia and Belarus, and the fact that Moldova, Ukraine, and Georgia are three countries that are pending potential NATO membership, you get an idea sitting in Moscow why this is seen as something that has to be taken as deadly serious and has to be responded to. So, as I say, I'm looking forward to opening up to discussion, questions, and the rest. So let's get that process going. And Matt, if you want to take back over.
Yes. I will do that. Thank you so much, Jeff. You could hit end screen share. I've reclaimed the hosting. Thank you so much for going through that condensed, sweeping series of historical lessons. You did that in a very concentrated, less than 1 hour time frame, which is incredible. What I would ask, Jeff, if you have any associated reading material that you would recommend that people have a look at or listen to, send that my way, and I'll put that in the description box under this video as well, so people could do some additional work on their own after I'm sure they'll be inspired and provoked by a lot of what you've said. So let's open up for Q&A. I've seen that Stephen has thrown out a question. Oh, wait, hold on. Yes, Stephen is the first one I see who has posed his name into the question box. So Stephen, go for it.
Okay, Jeff, thank you for a magnificent lecture. I really enjoyed it, found it informative. In terms of what your overall thesis was and the message of revisiting that longer term relationship, what came to mind was early in the Trump administration and the whole, I'll call it debacle with the Flynn conversation before the inauguration. Would it be correct, or would you agree with reading that as perhaps the Trump administration wanting to move in the direction that you're suggesting, and that the existing status quo powers that be fought tooth and nail to resist that?
I think that it's definitely a fair assumption. For one thing, General Flynn was the national security advisor to the president-elect. And the idea that somehow or other engaging in a certain degree of diplomatic discussions and preparatory towards the new administration coming in is somehow a violation of the Logan Act. I mean, that's just, preposterous. But I think that there was an impulse in that direction. I'll tell you, I have many criticisms of the Trump 4 years in office. But I have, with a couple of colleagues, a consulting company, and we have, most of our clients are in Japan. And so talk about, lack of real depth of understanding of US politics. So I had to give a presentation about 6 months into the Trump administration to an organization in Tokyo, one of the prominent think tanks. There was 100 or so people in the room there. And one of the things that was fascinating is that in some of his commentaries before becoming president, Donald Trump made reference to his Uncle John as somebody who was a kind of a shaping figure in his life. And so I was curious, who's John Trump? Anybody know? Yeah. He was a prominent scientist during the period of World War II. He was one of the people who developed aeronautic radar. He was sent over to England to be the American liaison to the British as they were, basically developing radar that was instrumental in the air war in Europe. And after that, he came back to the US. He was a distinguished professor for years at MIT and was an adamant opponent of nuclear weapons proliferation. And so it had a certain, impact on Trump. So I think that at a gut level, he said on many occasions, there's nothing wrong with having a good relationship with Russia and China. Was he successful in executing it? Absolutely not. I mean, the powers that be lined up, and I think he was largely unprepared and unable to deal with what was thrown up there. But I think, the impulse was probably there, and the ability to do something about it was really, a great failure, especially as he surrounded himself and circled his wagons more and more with people from the war party who, sort of took things over. But, there's many moments in history where there's clearly an opportunity, a brief opportunity, and you either seize that opportunity or you miss it. And, 1989 was one of those opportunities that I think was missed. The fact that, the best that the West could come up with was shock therapy to essentially help create an oligarchy and loot the country is another part of the legacy that you've got to look at and understand from the vantage point of Putin and some of the other Russian leaders who inherited that economic catastrophe when they came into power in the post-Yeltsin period.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. We have a question from Paula on polarization. Yes. Paula, go for it.
Yes, thank you. I hope you can hear me. Thank you for your lecture. And I think in your lecture you mentioned people like Truman, Eisenhower, and Churchill as sort of being against a true cooperation between Russia and America. And I wonder whether this fulfill their desire for divide and conquer and divide and rule. And so my question is, what sort of forces do you think have been all along behind this attempt to hamper a cooperation between Russia and the United States?
Well, I think, President Eisenhower in his farewell address put his thumb right on the problem, which was the emergence of a very powerful military industrial complex that had a deep vested interest in promoting conflict and war. Now, as I said, I presented a one-sided narrative. It was my intention to do that, but throughout the history of all of these US-Russian developments, there was as well always a deep anti-Russian prejudice among other elements. And so, this was all, I think, part of a much more complex picture. Eisenhower, as I say, had the wartime experience of the European theater under his belt. He worked closely with the Russian military commanders. And as I say, Marshal Zhukov happened to be the defense minister of the Soviet Union, somebody with whom Eisenhower had tremendous wartime collaboration. But for every one of those kinds of channels with some degree of understanding, there was an onrushing effort to go the other way. You could probably blame Harvard University for some of the disasters that befell the Russian economy during the 1990s with the policies of shock therapy, that failed recipes that never ever worked, but created the conditions for looting and for the rise of an oligarchy. And of course, remember that during the Bush 41, that's the Bush Senior administration, that was when Dick Cheney was Secretary of Defense, and his grand strategist was Paul Wolfowitz, who had the idea that the United States now finally had arrived at a unipolar moment where there were no strategic powers, individually or collectively, that could challenge the United States' global dominance. And so therefore, this was an opportunity for 20 or 30 years before China fully emerged, where the United States could go about a succession of regime changes and, you know, basically payback time for what had been, you know, countries that aligned with the Soviets during the Cold War. You know, one of the other aspects of why it was that the Soviets were prepared in the 1970s to negotiate détente agreements with the United States is that Brzezinski, under the influence of a British intelligence theoretician, Dr. Bernard Lewis, developed the strategy of building up an Islamic belt of instability along the entire southern tier of the Soviet Union. And when the Iranian regime was overthrown in February of 1979 and the Shah fled, the United States negotiated with China to install the same listening posts they had in northern Iran inside China along the borders with the Soviet Union. So there was an element of the United States under Brzezinski and Bernard Lewis playing a geopolitical game to essentially ally with China and targeting the Soviet Union. So there was a certain amount of diplomacy between the US and the Soviets that was a kind of a byproduct of that. But I would say that it was the attempt to establish an imperial dominant policy in the United States that was the source, the motherlode of all of the problems that subsequently emerged. And I think the good news is that culturally, the United States is lousy at empire. And, you know, if you look at every adventure that we've gotten into in the last 20 or 30 years, whether it's Afghanistan or Iraq or Libya, it's turned into a complete mess. And so, you know, I think that perhaps now there's at least a recognition that, you know, $3 trillion later and absolutely wrecking destruction on a number of countries that, you know, had no reason to be destroyed. Maybe there's an opportunity now to find some other pathway. But, you know, it was this combination of the military industrial complex, as Eisenhower called it, the emergence beginning in the 1970s of a bunch of former Trotskyites who became neoconservatives. And instead of talking about permanent revolution, they translated it into permanent war. And we're still suffering the consequences of that disastrous outlook.
That is going to be, I think, the topic of further questions, including my own. But before I go on to anybody else, and again, how the Trotskyites became the neocons is just the most fascinating thing to think about. But before we go into any of that, I'm looking at the list here, and Ed is about 7 hours ahead of us in Russia. So it's very late for Ed. And I figured Cynthia recommended that we just give Ed the baton here to throw out his questions so late at night. So Ed, why don't you pose your question?
Yeah, my question is more like a practical. Do we see any new names, potential for the White House, which can change this policy, which can get us in big trouble? Because at this point, more and more people think that we are heading into direct military confrontation. I mentioned in my chat two names which have no chances, but at least they speak, they make sense. It's Rand Paul, Senator, Republican, and Democrat Tulsi Gabbard. It's 2 out of 535 members of Congress. Maybe you can see some names who we should vote for in the next elections.
Well, I can certainly say that I have tremendous respect for both of them, especially Tulsi Gabbard, you know, who is really, you know, kind of fearlessly spoken truth to power. She's no longer in Congress. She declined to run for re-election. You know, after a few brief appearances in the Democratic debate, she was barred from participation through some really, you know, nasty backroom deals among the other Democrats, because she was putting them to shame on the most fundamental issues of war and peace. You know, I think that it's really hard under the current political system, so dominated by corrupt money, to you know, give you a really upbeat and happy answer to your question. I mean, it's an enormously important question. I believe that, you know, we may have some more limited possibilities to walk back a little bit from the hard confrontational relationship that's gotten worse and worse and worse between the United States and Russia. You know, I think that Bill Burns is somebody who, from a diplomatic standpoint, has an understanding and a willingness to, you know, look for avenues of potential cooperation with the Russians. It's noteworthy that he's over at CIA, so maybe he's going to be clamping down on some of the ideological spin that comes out of there, pretending to be intelligence. And I've noticed that he's been sent on some assignments that go far beyond the pale of what a normal CIA director would be doing. You know, meeting with Mullah Baradar in Kabul, being the first senior official to sit down face to face with the new Israeli government. You know, his memoir at least offers a glimmer of understanding and hope that, you know, some kind of more sanity can prevail on US-Russia policy. Part of the problem structurally right now is that it's very easy for Congress to impose sanctions, and it's not that easy for a president to undo them and actually, you know, move things in a more positive direction. The climate is so poisonous that nobody's ever going to talk about the fact that, you know, historically, Catherine the Great got control over the Crimea from the Ottoman Empire, and it was historically always a part of Russia until, for some quirky reason, maybe someone here knows the reason for it, but why it was transferred from the Russian Federation to the Ukrainian Federation is beyond my scope. But, you know, maybe something in Biden's experience, long career on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, being an outlier in the Obama administration on a number of foreign policies, maybe the choice of Burns is indicative of some openness to trying to find some directionality. I know Lavrov and Putin and Shoigu and some other Russian officials have said they see a glimmer of opportunity to at least resume a civilized discussion with the U.S. And you know, that's a baby step, but any step that goes in a different direction is welcome. So Tulsi Gabbard, if she steps up, she's got my vote. I see Marty knows why the transfer happened.
Yeah, I was going to say, I saw a little light flash on the top of Marty's head when you said that. Marty, did you
know
have
it well,
something you wanted to chime
exactly.
in quickly on before I call on you?
Oh, yes, certainly. Khrushchev did it, I believe it was in 1954.
Right.
It was notorious even then. Khrushchev, of course, was in a paradoxical situation. He was head of the Soviet state, but he was a Ukrainian. He had also been directly responsible, more than anyone else except Molotov and Stalin themselves, for killing Ukrainians during the Holodomor and during the repression of the Great Terror. So he was an ambiguous figure. So he rewarded, quote unquote, Ukraine by giving them Crimea. And this was enormously unpopular and looked upon with contempt in Russia at the time. At the same time, its long-term significance was not recognized because nobody in either Ukraine or Russia could visualize the Soviet Union disintegrating. Just as almost nobody in Britain can still imagine the United Kingdom disintegrating, which it is already well on the way to doing. But it was Khrushchev.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Thank you. Makes sense.
Exactly.
All right. So we got, and Marty, I'm going to call on you for your big question in about three questions time from now.
Whatever. Okay.
We have Ryan, who's been waiting. Ryan, go for it.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. First, thanks, Jeff, for this lovely presentation. I found it was very succinct and overarching. My question is in regards to this natural alliance between Russia and US pre-Bolshevik Revolution. You mentioned that geography, the size of the country, as well as the population, created some sort of, natural link between both countries. But is there something else other than that? Are there more fundamental aspects that link both these countries together?
Very definitely. The establishment of the Russian Academy of Sciences was a project that was part of Leibniz's effort to, stimulate science and Republican intellectual discussion across Europe. So that as the United States was coming into existence and developing the early forms of particularly economic policy, there was an existing vehicle in St. Petersburg. There was an intellectual structure in place that was open as a kind of a receptacle to those ideas. So, the American writings, I just gave one example of the translation of Alexander Hamilton's report to Congress on the subject of manufactures. But that was just one of many documents and many ideas that cross-fertilized back and forth. So, it wasn't just some sort of geo-economic, natural phenomenon that, sprang forth from the trees and the mountains and lakes or something. It was that there was an intellectual framework for those ideas to be able to be transmitted. And there were many, many other instances of that kind of back and forth. One of the courses I teach down here is on the Constitutional Convention and the aftermath. And, what's very clear is that of all of the founding fathers who were part of the original Washington cabinet, Hamilton had the clearest blueprint of what he wanted to accomplish. He staffed up the Treasury Department with a large number of people at the same time that the State Department had about 3 people. The Department of War was small. And so he really was a kind of a force of nature, pushing forward policies that effectively accelerated the actual development of the US economy and the prosperity of the population. It was something that was visible to others around the world. The fact that you had John Quincy Adams in Moscow for 6 years, or in St. Petersburg for 6 years. You know, he was like the child protege of the American Revolution, and, you know, carried that experience as a teenager all the way through his entire career as president, then in the Congress. And, you know, he created American diplomacy. If you want to read something that is a marvelous expression of American foreign policy as it was envisioned at that time, read the speech that he gave on the 4th of July, 1821, celebrating the 4th of July at a joint session of the Congress. It lays out in spectacular detail. That's where he says, we don't go overseas looking for monsters to slay. But it's much more than that. So his presence in Russia was a powerful factor in conveying some of the best of these ideas. There was always in Russia a tremendous flourishing of science. I know there have been other discussions in this seminar series on the role of Vernadsky. And of course, Leibniz himself was a sort of intellectual giant who influenced both the American and Russian leading scientific and philosophical circles. So all of those factors came to bear in this. But one of the things I think that was very clear was that under two extremely different political systems, there was a sense of mission, of desire to grow, to exploit the resources that were available. And as distinct from the European colonial powers, the United States was a shining example to many in Russia of a directionality to take. And the US didn't try to say, well, if you don't have democratic elections, then you're nothing. You know, the whole issue of that everybody somehow or other has some gene, some DNA, that their goal in life ultimately, no matter what their culture or background is to shop in Beverly Hills. That's, you know, that was not part of the American idea.
Exactly.
You know,
No.
yeah.
Well said. Pascal has been waiting for a while to pose a question. Pascal, it's all yours.
All right. Hey, hi, Jeff. Long time no
How
see.
are you? Good to see you.
I'm good, good.
Good.
I'm happy to see you're still kicking and hard. That's good. I don't know if I really have a question. I have tons of questions, but since it's not a one-on-one and we're in public, I'm gonna refrain. I gave some presentations on FDR and JFK, and you did rehabilitate Eisenhower in my mind today, because I didn't really have anything good to say about him. But I think one, yeah, that's more of a comment. But one thing you stressed during the presentation, I thought was really like a thread going on, is really all these missed opportunities where, you know, the United States and Russia really had everything to work together, and bad leadership or, you know, oligarchical interference made it so that it never really happened the way it should have. You know, like when you mentioned the 1916 completion of the Trans-Siberian Railroad, I can only imagine, you know, what would have happened if, you know, World War I was not going on at that time. And the linkage between Russia and the United States. And it's something, you know, most people don't know and don't appreciate. And I was listening to the radio this today, and I think it applies to China too. But, you know, how would you respond to people saying, you know, oh, but the United States is a democracy, it's a, you know, a presidential system, and in Russia it's a dictatorship, you know, Putin or Xi Jinping, it can't work. It's not supposed to work together. That's what I heard on the radio. I was kind of hit my head on the steering wheel, but you know, I would just ask that. How would you respond to that?
Well, look, I think, what I've said is that if you don't love the diversity of historical and cultural experiences and develop a healthy respect for how different societies have developed their form of government and their form of politics, if you can't look for the things that are universal, then you're really left with a worldview that's completely wrapped around prejudices, that anybody who's not doing exactly what you're doing is somehow or other inferior or wrong and has to be attacked. One of the things that I always found fascinating with Leibniz was that, here he is, Europe has just come out of the 30 Years' War, prospects of further conflict, and he looks at China and he's looking through the eyes of a lot of the Jesuit missionaries that were over there and writing reports back, and he says, my God, they've got something going. They have this sort of tranquil society, and he looked at a deeper level and looked to find parallels between Confucian outlook and Western Christianity, and focused on those things and saw it as a learning experience. When I read the book by Elliot Roosevelt, As He Saw It, one of the things that comes across is that Roosevelt had an almost like childlike fascination with what he saw during his international travels. I mean, he was a wealthy, well-traveled person. He had a little bit of bias against Germans, I think, but when he was going to the Casablanca conference and he saw Africa, and he said, my God, the potential of this is wonderful. How can we do it? So it's a mindset, and it's not narrowly specific to one culture, to one religion, to one national system of political economy. It's something that's a universal characteristic of human beings who really, are genuinely committed to the success of mankind. And so whatever form of government, obviously there's certain extremities that you've got to be bothered by, but, most cultures have a certain capacity for self-correction. There's some things that are going on in China right now that I'm a bit critical of, but I think that, if they don't work, they're very experimental. Everything that China does starts out with a pilot project. See if it works. If it works, let's spread it out. If it doesn't work, we'll file it and forget about it. So, that's, to my mind, that's really, the fault line is between people who, love humanity and are committed to doing what they can in whatever way they can to advance it, versus those that, believe that if it ain't being done their way, under their control, then it's something that's got to be stamped out.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Great.
We have Marty, do you still have a question, thought you wanted to share?
Yes, not even a question so much as applause and confirmation, Matt. Full enthusiastic, in fact, agreement. I hope that doesn't backfire on him for everything Jeff has said. But I've got a couple of confirmatory points I'd like to add. First of all, I was the chief foreign correspondent dealing with Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union during the collapse of communism. And this put me in a very favorable seat as a very favorable observer for what was going on then. And from everything I observed, Jeff is exactly right on the money. And of course, he knows this, but I think this is such an important issue, it needs to be confirmed in every way possible, that the United States government, two successive presidents, both Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush, both stressed that NATO expansion would stop with the unification of Germany. They both gave solemn words, guarantees to two successive leaders in Moscow, the last president of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, and the first, at the time, supposedly democratic president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin, though he was in fact much less democratic than Vladimir Putin has ever been, which is another something we should explore in another time, because the big lie, of course, says the opposite, but it is a big lie at the first point. I was also in Russia and a great deal on behalf of the Washington Times through the 1990s, and I saw dead people on the streets, even in Moscow, and much more around the country. Russian estimates put the number of dead from their Great Depression between 20 to 30 million, a death toll comparable to what they lost in the Great Patriotic War of World War II. And my personal observations support this, because I was there and I saw dead bodies, and that was just in the streets. Most of the dead were the very old and the very young who gave up the ghost. And the number of abortions, which had been out of control throughout the Soviet era, simply metastasized after the collapse of communism because of the economic collapse. So Russia was looted under the so-called crash program, exactly the way Jeff said. But I was there, I saw it, I was an eyewitness. But a key point is the Russians sat back and showed enormous restraint for 25 years when we broke the solemn assurances of two presidents that we would not expand NATO beyond, let's see, it wouldn't have been the Elbe, it would have been the Oder, beyond the Oder River, to include, I mean, even including Poland alone is red hot for two reasons. First, because Poles are fanatically anti-Russian. The prejudice to this day goes extremely deep. And again, I speak with first-hand observation on Zbigniew Brzezinski. Zbig was in no way an anti-Jewish racist. He was in no way an anti-Black racist. In fact, he was one of the people who recommended Barack Obama as a young and brilliant potential student and potential president even to David Rockefeller. Right. But he was ferociously racist about all Russians. It is impossible to exaggerate how deep this goes. And I had great access to Zbig in the late 1980s and 1990s, because I was reporting in the Washington Times that the Soviet Union was disintegrating before almost anyone else was. And this, of course, was exactly what he wanted to hear. But he wasn't just anti-communist as he presented himself. He was racistly anti-Russian from beginning to end. And this is crucial. A brief point on the Kennedy, I never expect, a book I am actually looking for a publisher for right now is my book on human rights heroes who saved hundreds of thousands of people from Holocausts or who ended genocides. And one of my heroes is Khrushchev. And I make the point that Khrushchev was a terrible communist killer, one of the worst of them in Ukraine for most of his career. But he was the man who freed 13 million people from Gulag. Not only did he not have to do it, it was extraordinarily difficult to do, and he pulled it off. This is one of the great humanitarian achievements of the century. I don't think you can find a similar liberalization within an existing system without collapsing that system anywhere. It's very fascinating. But one of the things I found in my research on Khrushchev, and again, I did not expect this, was that, again, Jeff is right on the money. The key relationship that between the United States and the Soviet Union in the 1950s in preventing the risk of thermonuclear war, when both countries had just developed the hydrogen bomb and were at the height of the tension, was the personal friendship and relationship between Dwight D. Eisenhower as President of the United States and the Soviet Minister of Defense under Khrushchev, not with Khrushchev directly. In the end, Khrushchev had a much closer relationship than Kennedy at the end, in the last year of Kennedy's life, than he did with Eisenhower. The key figure was Zhukov as Minister of Defense. And once Khrushchev dumps from 1953, 54 to 1958, there is a remarkable degree of stability because of the relationship between the two. Their meeting at Geneva in 1955 is particularly important. Very revealingly, in 1958, when Zhukov is fired in the most humiliating way by Khrushchev, Eisenhower uses the entire diplomatic organization of the United States to get a personal present to Khrushchev. They're both avid fishermen, freshwater fishermen. And Eisenhower arranges for the most expensive and highest quality American fishing equipment possible to be given to Khrushchev for his hobby. And of course, this is also a very important diplomatic signature, a signal being sent: do not kill Zhukov. Do not purge him the way you have purged so many other people. We think very highly of Zhukov. You cannot afford to enrage us this way. This is a message Eisenhower sent. But from Khrushchev's side, he was so moved by this that his son and family testify that he used Eisenhower's gift to the end of his life. It was extremely precious to him. One last point, and again, as usual, I'm shooting around here, but I want to add my consensus, for what it's worth, to what both Jeff and Eddie were saying. I mean, those are two very impressive people separately. When they're in full agreement on pushing a presidential candidate, well, I couldn't agree more with them on Tulsi Gabbard. My further suggestion, though, is this: Tulsi will never be allowed anywhere in what's left of the Democratic Party. And I think what we're going to see in the next if there is major inflation to follow the catastrophe in Afghanistan, then the Democrats are much closer to total destruction as they were before the Civil War than anybody can imagine, possibly realize. I think Tulsi's prospects would be in the Republican Party as an heir to Trump, as a libertarian-leaning heir to Trump of a new generation. And it's too soon for her to push for the presidency directly in 2024. She would have no credibility, but she would be a dream vice presidential candidate for a nationalist movement. And for a while, I thought Cruz would be the guy to lead it, but Cruz is too obvious. Exactly. You said this to me before, and you were right, of course, Matt. But I think the guy to watch, like him or loathe him, is Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida. The old Irish joke about politics, and the Irish know politics better than any other Americans, is the key thing is sincerity. Once you can fake that, you've got it made. And DeSantis proved in the collapsed condo disaster in Miami. I mean, he was probably more responsible for that than anyone else, because the condo collapsed because nobody was bothered checking it, because the old Republicans have this fetish about minimum government, meaning you can run up trash anywhere and not bother having public standards on it. But he nevertheless was able to signal compassion and care for the survivors and the family of the dead. And what does that show us? It shows us this is a man with the cynicism and flexibility and pure political talent. And there isn't much of that showing anywhere in the Republican Party. People like Nikki Haley are old neocons and just jokes. And the grassroots of the party, Trump is too old, but they want somebody pushing the Trump policies. Ultimately, I think Tulsi Gabbard is our best hope. And I see no hope of anyone on the Democratic side, not in the slightest. The irony is the only person they have, and I finish on this, with any sense of responsibility for the survival of the world is old Joe Biden himself. But exactly, he's a busted flush anyway, because Afghanistan is such a fiasco. He is 78 years old, and unlike Trump, does not wear his years lightly or energetically. And they're going to be stuck with Kamala for at least a year or two, I think, before the next presidential election cycle, if we get that far. And that will be a catastrophe for them. She just doesn't have any capability whatsoever. I'm sorry, I'm covering several different areas here, but the key point I simply want to make is, again, the betrayal of 1988 to 1992, the assurances that were given to the Russians, the fact that nobody is even allowed to acknowledge that these assurances were ever made. And one last point I'll make here, and it's very significant, is there is a group in Washington called VIPS, VIPS, Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. Eddie works with them very constructively, and so do I. And this is very eminent and senior people who are at the very top level of diplomacy, the military, politics, and most of all, intelligence in the Reagan and Bush years. And they were part of or personally witnessed these assurances being made to Russia. And they are the very people, old Reaganite Cold Warriors, as they started out in a way, who are the most horrified at the degrees of extremism and absurdity to which US policy has steadily degenerated over the last 25 to 30 years. And all of this, again, simply confirms Jeff's marvelous analysis. Thank you.
Let me throw something in because Marty, you referenced the 1850s and the collapse of the Democratic Party, and my own personal view is that when the Whig Party failed to nominate Henry Clay as their candidate, that was their swan song as well. And so we went through a period of about 10 or 15 years where both political parties were bankrupt. Yes. And what came out of that was a political realignment. And what I'm hopeful for, more than looking at an individual, and I agree with you that, that Tulsi is a unique person, but probably not for the next foreseeable few years.
Yes.
I'm hopeful that the fault lines within the two parties are so pronounced that we're going to see some substantial political realignments over the course of the next one or two presidential election cycles. And, I think that the fact that you had a group of Democrats and Republicans in the Senate who worked with the White House, Biden in particular, more than, the kind of junior frolics that he's surrounded with, on developing this bipartisan agreement on infrastructure, holds maybe the seed crystal of that kind of realignment. You got 8 members of the House in this thing called the Problem Solvers Caucus, which I like the idea of it. And you always have tended to have sort of centrist groupings within the Senate that have some sense of the history of the institution. Yes. And hold that dear over and above whatever particular political or ideological differences they might have. So I think that if we can get some kind of, substantive debate over how such a realignment might work, could be something to watch for over the next decade. I do agree with you. This is not something that you're going to just drop a pill in water and it's going to materialize. It's going to be a arduous and painful process, but I see it happening, and it's not the first time, it's not even the second time in our history. John Kennedy's book, Profiles in Courage, that he wrote when he was a senator, the first substantive chapter of it is about John Quincy Adams leaving the Federalists because he found some of their politics objectionable, and he had the courage to not go along to get along. So anyway, I think that if that kind of dynamic plays out, I'm confident that people will emerge as viable potential candidates of that kind of a different process, less beholden to the rotten backroom deals. It used to be in the old days that everybody smoked. So deals were made in smoke-filled rooms. And my joke is that these days there's nobody smoking anymore, but they're schmuck-filled rooms.
So true.
That's good.
Absolutely, Jeff.
That's good. Jeff, before I go into more questions, I got to know, what's your schedule look like? How much time do you still have on your schedule?
Like another half hour.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Okay. All right. We can work with that. All right. So Chad, I missed your name. I'm sorry. So I skipped over Chad. Chad, go for it.
Yes. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Microphone working. Yeah. That was very interesting, Marty. Thank you. I wanted to go back to the Bush-Cheney period, which we, were talking about before. And my question is, for Jeff, what about the Project Hammer, where, as I understand it,
Yes.
Bush Sr. Pushed the USSR into bankruptcy by intervening, in their economy, and from that got the profit of $240 billion in 10-year treasuries that were off balance sheet. And my understanding is, they came due 10 years later on September 14th, 2001. And one of the motivations for the 9/11 event was as an excuse to shut down for the Fed to shut down the normal process of securities transactions, to move those notes from off balance sheet to on balance sheet. So what do you think about that? What role did that play in the dynamics between the two countries?
Well, I know that during the Reagan administration, there were pulls in a lot of different directions. Reagan had his own idea, and I believe was honestly, profoundly committed to the notion that we had to bring an end to this horrible situation of mutually assured destruction. And that was a powerfully held belief. I know that from personal interaction at the time with people at the White House who were working directly on the diplomacy, behind the scenes diplomacy with the Soviets. But at the same time, there were others in the administration who understood the Soviet vulnerability and knew that they could exploit forms of financial and economic warfare. That was another part of the equation. And of course, the Reagan administration was really the sort of entree point for a number of the neoconservatives who would later, really blossom fully under George W. Bush's administration with Cheney as vice president. But so I think it was at best a very mixed legacy. The Reagan administration, Casey in particular, enthusiastically picked up on Brzezinski's idea about playing the Islamic card across the whole southern tier of the Soviet Union. And it was clearly understood that this was part of the efforts to basically disrupt and bring down the whole Soviet system. Reagan was, in a certain sense, an outlier in his own administration in his pursuit of the nuclear disarmament track. Now, to my mind, the most significant economic factor during the period running from the Reagan administration into Bush and then into Clinton was a concerted effort that was launched out of J.P. Morgan to bring an end to Glass-Steagall. And that was both a domestic monetary and financial effort, but it had, profound international implications. It monetized all economics, and in 1984, J.P. Morgan had a study group, and they produced a paper that's publicly available online called Rethinking Glass-Steagall. And they looked at how they can go about tearing it down and ultimately ending it.
Exactly.
And one of the key people on that task force was Alan Greenspan. He was at J.P. Morgan as a senior partner at the time. Another person was William Dudley, who later became head of the New York Fed. And so in '87, when Greenspan replaced Volcker as chairman of the Fed, he began immediately to put that blueprint into practice. And he stretched the limits of flexibility given to the Fed chairman to begin allowing the commercial banks to start buying up more and more investment banks and insurance companies, and Citibank kind of took the lead in it. And so by the mid 1990s, coincident with Clinton being impeached, Congress by this point had been thoroughly bought off by Wall Street. I think they spent $300 million in lining the pockets of members of the House and Senate Finance Committees to finally get to the point where they had an overwhelming majority, a veto-proof majority, to repeal Glass-Steagall. And that was really, in a certain sense, the essential turning point event that we saw play out in 2008 with the development of derivatives, quantitative easing, and all of the rest. So in a certain sense, ironically, the margin of financial warfare that we ran against the Soviet Union and Russia, as bad as it was, and I think Marty's numbers are absolutely rock solid about more people dying in the 90s through economic hardship than died in the Great War. But whatever we did to the Soviets and then Russia afterwards, we did to ourselves far worse. And we're paying the consequences of that, you know, right now to the present. You know, the problem has been that I teach a class on the Constitutional Convention called The Republic If You Can Keep It. And at the end of the class, my one final exam question to the students is, I want you to come up with a list of the 10 best presidents. You know, number 1, the best, and work your way down to 10. And I said, but I will make a bet with all of you. Unless you cheat, no two people are going to come up with the same list. Everybody's going to have George Washington. Everybody's going to have Abraham Lincoln. Everybody's going to have Franklin Roosevelt. And most of you, the majority, will have Kennedy. After that, it's a crapshoot. And so we've had 46 or so presidents, and we can count on one hand the number who really were extraordinary leaders. I mean, I would add a number of others to that, but you know, the basic common knowledge, I think it's true that we've had a lot of, you know, well-meaning but mediocre presidents. We've had a very small handful of great presidents who really commanded authority over all of the aspects of policy and were able to bring a sort of a coherent top-down strategy to bear. You know, Roosevelt obviously, you know, had a certain mastery and had a kind of a patrician stature to be able to accomplish a great number of things. Lincoln in a completely different way. Washington is probably one of the most underrated presidents in terms of, you know, just the novelty of being the first president and setting precedents that carry forward to this day. So the problem has been that we've rarely had leadership that has been able to develop a coherent, strategic, political and economic framework and being able to find like-minded people to implement it effectively. Mm-hmm. So, you know, that to my mind was a big challenge. I think, you know, I remember Jim Baker coming under a brutal attack. The term they used was chicken Kiev, when, you know, he, you know, basically said, we're not going to try to exploit the disintegration of the Soviet Union for, you know, our own, you know, benefits. And, you know, that was the context of that agreement about no eastward movement of NATO. Mm. So since I don't have a lot of time, I guess let me give shorter answers and try to get as many of the other people as possible.
We have 6 questions, so we're going to try to condense if possible to make this all happen. And I think just flowing off of what you were saying, I think I just wanted to chime in quickly that I think the perennial point of combat throughout history, especially in the Republic, has been to create institutions of Republican cultural development that can transcend individual presidencies and lives, that could become something normatized and which could create cultural a cultural uplifting, so that you don't have the problem of a president getting assassinated and then no one left to pick up the torch, and then, you know, a cultural degeneration into chaos time and again, which is always and still is the issue. I think ultimately is this cultural fight, which maybe we can get you to speak on in some future underdefined event.
Mhm.
But Hugh has been waiting. Hugh Trudeau. So Hugh, where are you? You can pose your question. We might have lost Hugh.
Oh no, here I am.
Hey, Hugh. Okay.
Okay, this is a diversion from American domestic politics to probably more geopolitics. And the question is, what would it take to make an empire based on sea power and control of the sea lanes, allow the construction of a global railroad that would circumvent or seriously reduce their power? So what do you think? I mean, because that's what, here in Canada, in the 60s, we had a railroad started heading for Alaska from BC, and it could have gone elsewhere. It got stopped by an election, maybe an overthrow of Wack Bennett. Recently, we had people proposing a railway from northern Alberta to an Alaskan port, and our current prime minister basically said it'll never get past the environmental assessment. So that's bang. So what would it take to get a railway built in the face of an empire that depends on sea lanes?
Well, I would recommend ask China, because they're doing both. You know, the signature program that Xi Jinping launched in 2013 when he went to the University of Astana, what's now referred to as the Belt and Road Initiative, is exactly that. China not only has built 20,000 kilometers of high-speed rail inside China, but they've built rail links, invested in railroad construction to link up existing rail lines to where there's now a dozen different overland transit routes that carry all the way into Western Europe. At the same time,
if I may, the question is about linking America and Eurasia. That's what's not going to be allowed.
Well,
how's that going to happen?
I would strongly favor two things. Number one, this Bering Straits project, it's not expensive. It's a $10 billion project. That's, you know, by the amounts that we've spent to deal with the COVID-19, that's chump change. Secondly, I would say that rather than taking a hostile aggressive approach towards what the Chinese are doing with the Belt and Road Initiative, we should look for areas of cooperation. The Trump administration merged the Overseas Private Investment Corporation with a small development bank in USAID, and now we have an International Development Finance Corporation that at least structurally could participate. I was at an event in Washington soon after the Chinese launched the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And it was the day after all of the European countries shocked the Obama administration by joining. And, you know, suddenly the US was sort of the odd man out, squeezing Japan and South Korea to stay out of it. But Kurt Campbell was speaking at an event at the Jamestown Foundation, and he was cursing the fact that the US should have gotten in the middle of it, should have joined it, and at least had a seat at the table to shape the directionality. So there's nothing prohibiting the United States from abandoning the Washington consensus, the IMF World Bank policy of denying development to the developing sector. And we should get in on the action. And if we're worried about the Chinese making great geopolitical gains as a byproduct of $1 trillion in real investment, then let's join the competition and do the same kind of thing. So there's nothing standing in the way of it. And if anything, the Chinese initiatives have become a forcing mechanism for countries in the West to reconsider, you know, this long past history of preventing development through agencies that were originally created ostensibly to promote it.
Right, thank you.
So you're basically saying having a global Green New Deal, build back better for the world is not the right approach, despite the fact that some people think that.
Yeah, you got that.
Hi, darling.
Right. Matt, I got 5 more minutes because I have
5 more minutes? Okay, all right, so let's do this.
more things I have to get to tonight.
So let's just do Bob and Kwan, and then I'll say a few words to wrap it up. But Bob, I know you've been waiting, go for it. If you can do it quick.
Okay, I had a question about the Yeltsin years and how the assets, the Russian assets, were sold off and how they were financed. In the case, there were taxi drivers, I don't know, candlestick makers, people of humble backgrounds that actually became oligarchs overnight. And what was that connection? I understand there was a connection with the London banks, but then how come Putin, once he sort of gained control, I know he had Khodorkovsky and a couple others that were disciplined, but how do you let somebody take a hold of national assets like whether it's banking or mining or whatever industries the oligarchs took over, because many of them are still in control, and I'm surprised that there hasn't been some kind of repercussions.
Well, to give a short answer to a really important question that deserves a lot more of a response, when you dig deep, you find that a number of the people who emerged during the Yeltsin period as oligarchs had already, during an earlier period, been going to places like London to the Adam Smith Institute and were getting trained. They were being groomed. You know, Boris Berezovsky was a math teacher, but he was one of those people who was sent to London. And this was during the, Gorbachev years when, under the openings, people were given a little bit, more access. So I think that what happened during that period, first of all, everybody in Russia was given a small sort of a token amount of money, basically shares in the assets of the state that were to be privatized post-communism. And people were desperately poor. They were selling them, for pennies on the dollar or pennies on the ruble in order to get a little bit of cash in their pocket at the moment when, you had this complete breakdown of the entire Russian economy. So those who swooped in and gathered up and, used those sources of funding were promoted. A lot of them had connections to the Russian intelligence services. It wasn't just simply random individuals. And so what happened during the Yeltsin period is that an oligarchical structure more powerful than the state came into control. When Putin came in, one of the very first things that he did, what he was capable of doing, was it was like Christmas during the first year that he replaced Yeltsin. He called everybody to the Kremlin, all the oligarchs, and he said, you've got 3 choices. You either cooperate with the state, in other words, you're going to become subservient to the state structure that I'm putting together in the Kremlin, or you take your money and run, move to England, buy yourself a football club, live out your life in exile, or test me out and see what happens. So Khodorkovsky was the test case. A lot of other people left. Others fell in line. There was a sort of a recasting of the oligarchy, but it became an instrument of state power rather than the oligarchy essentially controlling a situation that was completely unregulated and uncontrolled by a weak and confused government. So that was one of the first big things that Putin accomplished. He brought some sort of state control and regulatory authority over it. He's still, trying to play a balancing act between relations with Western finance and nationalist currents inside Russia. And so it's something that's, I consider it still very much to be a work in progress.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Jeff.
All right. So just to squeeze in one last question here. I know Kwan has been waiting. Kwan, go for it. Pose your question.
Hi, Jeff. Thanks for your outstanding lecture. One of my fantasy is that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization would be capable to deter the warmongers not to start Armageddon, and to allow thus the American patriots to have the upper hand inside the USA and join BRI. What do you think?
I don't rule it out. Right now, the big test case is that the SCO is clearly the mechanism for trying to bring some post-US NATO stability to Afghanistan. Afghanistan's got a standing application to be given full membership, and when the heads of state meet in October, it seems to me it's a no-brainer that Afghanistan should be brought in, regardless of what precise form the government in Kabul takes. I mean, clearly the Taliban's going to have a dominant position in it. I know people high up. I have a very close friend who's a retired four-star Navy admiral who was urging back in the time of the Obama administration that the US should pre-negotiate an arrangement with the SCO for an orderly US and NATO withdrawal, with the understanding that the SCO would create a security structure to bring stability to Afghanistan. Afghanistan is an integral part of the China-Pakistan economic corridor, and there's already offers for Afghanistan to be included in that process because it's a natural route for trade from Central Asia down into the ports in the Arabian Sea and Indian Ocean. The Russian National Rail Corporation has a contract to begin this month building a new modern rail line between Kabul and Mazar-e-Sharif in the north of Afghanistan. So there's ample opportunities there, and it's a work in progress, and we're going to just have to see what happens. And I agree that sane patriots on the US side ought to see the opportunity to build a cooperative arrangement with the other leading world powers and get involved in some of these development structures. I can't give odds on whether that's going to happen or not, but it's certainly another one of these moments of opportunity, which is either going to be jumped on fast, grab the gold ring, or it's going to be lost fairly quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So I really better call it quits here, Matt.
That you did great. No, Jeff, you did more than great. Thank you so much. And I got to just say to everybody here who came out and spent their Sunday listening, we are now, and actually before I say what I'm about to say, Jeff, I didn't get to ask my question on how the Trotskyites became the Christian funding neocons, which hopefully maybe at some future presentation I can implore you to maybe elaborate on, because I think that that's just such a big component of tying together a lot of the mysteries of what happened in Russia as well as what happened in the West, and what Stalin was actually dealing with. But that's maybe for the future. So
it'll be X-rated with a lot of French novels thrown in.
Great. That's exciting. All right, I love that. So,
oh my God, I can't wait for that.
All right. So for next week, we have Jerry Therrien, who's going to be doing something on From Shelley to Plato, Why the Poets Are the Unacknowledged Legislators of the World, to tackle the underlying cultural question, which has been sort of floating over the last 3 months of classes, as an epilogue to tie it all together. We have Marty Seif, who has been preparing something on Ulysses S. Grant, who is in many ways a poet statesman unto his own right, who intervened onto the stage of history. And we're going to have some stuff on the Pan-African movement, Chikante Diop, delivered by Nick Jones very soon and some other surprises along the way. So Jeff just stepped out. Everyone, I hope to see you all next week for Jerry's class. Thank you all for coming, and till next week.